Good morning, students. Happy to be with you here today. Can't believe that we're already on the May the 4th be with you. Today we are going to be looking at the end of World War II. I know it seems like we've skipped through most of World War II, and believe me, if things were normal in school, I would not do that. I would spend a lot more time and detail on it. However, things being as they are, we're going to do the best we can. So today, I hope you're still working on your World War II projects. Those need to be uploaded to the Flipgrid by 10 o'clock tonight. And then by the end of the week, you need to respond to at least one other student's project that's not your own. And just say, give some good feedback on what you learned, something that was interesting that you're like, oh, I didn't know that about whatever the topic may have been. So we're going to move on, and really I'm going to pretty much blow through what happened, the details of how much detail we would get in of what happened in World War II. But then when we're going to come to the end of World War II, that's where the discussion will take place. So keep in mind, Hitler has been doing a lot of things to kind of build his right, to build his empire. And remember, a lot of it was done legally. The Nuremberg laws were legal. The power that he got from the chancellor or from the president, Hindenburg, was legal. So Hitler is gaining a lot of power. He's very persuasive. He's a very good speaker and orator, and he gets a lot of people fired up. And so and remember, they just kind of let him do things. That was the big question on British appeasement. The British are kind of looked at as the ones who should have stopped Hitler in his tracks, and they didn't. But, other countries could have stepped up and said, no, we're not allowing this to happen. Austria did not necessarily like to be annexed and kind of brought into the German fold, but they did. So Hitler was doing a lot of things to kind of prepare for war, if you will. But it wasn't just war, it's also the Holocaust. So when we get into the beginning of the war, remember it happens September 1st, 1939, when Hitler invades Poland. Now, remember when I said that Hitler and Stalin had signed a non-aggression pact, which means you don't hurt us, we won't hurt you. Well, think of where Poland is. It's smack dab in the middle of Germany and the USSR. So when Hitler invades Poland on September 1st, 1939, this puts Stalin on alert because he does not want to let Hitler have all of Poland. So now, remember, when you mobilize troops, that's an act of war. So Hitler doesn't have to declare war on Poland. He just goes in there and takes it. One thing that I will add, that the reason why World War II and World War I are so different, remember I kind of said that World War II was just an extension of World War I, but two big differences between World War I and World War II, at the beginning at least of World War II, is the tanks. And German tanks were superior. So when Hitler rolls in, literally in his tanks, into Poland, the Polish people don't have a chance. I mean, there is no chance of beating the German panzer divisions. Panzers are what are called German tanks. So tanks were a big difference between, and they had tanks some in World War I, but not a lot and not efficient. By the time we get to World War II, very, very efficient. It's kind of what's going to make the difference in World War II. The other thing is the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. Remember, in part of the Treaty of Versailles said the Germany couldn't develop and form an air force. Well, they did, and they formed a pretty good one. Probably not as good as their tanks, but they formed a really strong air force. So Hitler launches his blitzkrieg, and he's doing the blitzkrieg on London when Germany invades Poland. In response, France and Britain declare war on Germany. Well, now Hitler is going to try to bomb London back to the Dark Ages, and he's launching a blitzkrieg. And a blitz is just, it's the word is lightning war, where you drop thousands and thousands and thousands of tons of bombs on an area. Like, you just keep bombarding them to put them into kind of shock. So we're just going to really kind of skip through a lot of this. France was pretty much overtaken. The northern part of France was occupied by the Germans. Paris was quickly overrun. The southern part was what was called Vichy. It was not occupied by Germany, but the Vichy regime was very sympathetic to Hitler's hatred of Jewish people. So the Vichy regime is in France. It's not controlled by Germany, but it almost seems like they're more on the German side than the French side. So war is raging on. The Soviets are fighting in the east, and they are fighting as hard as Soviets always fight. And Germany is got a two-front war here. But they're not the only ones with the two-front war. Remember, it's never probably the greatest idea to separate your forces. However, the United States has been staying out of this war. Just like in World War I, the United States wants to stay out of World War II. But that's what's on the surface. What we need to understand is by 1941, we have thousands of naval troops being stationed in very strategic areas in the Pacific Ocean. And one of these is on the island of Hawaii. Now, Hawaii is not yet a United States, but it is controlled by, it's called a Commonwealth. So it's controlled by the United States, which is a kind of a sad story, but a story for later on. The Japanese are going to bomb Pearl Harbor. The bombing of Pearl Harbor is a day which will live in infamy. If you wouldn't mind, I would like you to just listen to at least the first part of what President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, said on the day that, about the day the world changed. It was called A Day That Lived in Infamy. Infamy means that it'll be famous for being bad. And it changes everything. It forces the United States into war when we are suddenly and deliberately attacked. These are the words that FDR uses. However, what are we doing in this tiny little island that's not even a state in the Pacific? Well, we're trying to kind of keep Japan at bay, if you will, and continue our trade routes in the Pacific between China, especially, and the United States. So now a war is going to be raging in the Pacific, and a war is going on in Europe. And when the United States is forced into war, we're going to separate our troops. Now, we have to keep trying to fight off the Pacific, keep fighting off the Japanese in the Pacific. However, many military leaders felt that it was more important to focus most of the attention on the European theater, on Europe, and stopping the aggression of Hitler. So while many men were in, especially the Navy and the Marines, in the Pacific, a lot of that gets forgotten in 1942 and 1943, but it's very important. What's happening in Europe in 42 and 43 is not actually so much in Europe. It's starting in North Africa. And they decide, if you have ever heard of El Alamein, El Alamein is kind of the turning point. This is where this guy here on the right, his name is Erwin Rommel. Rommel was a fantastic strategic military leader. He's a tank commander, and he is defeated in North Africa. And when he's defeated in North Africa, because remember, Germany and Italy were friends together, and North Africa was being almost terrorized, if you will, by Italy and Germany to an extent. But when Italy had tried to take Ethiopia with Il Duce Mussolini, this is when we decided to focus on North Africa. But before before the Allied powers can even get to Europe, they have to take and seal off North Africa and that whole Mediterranean area. Eventually, they worked their way up the coast of Italy, and those are some real hard-fought years. I would like to say that the Holocaust is as big of a player in the war as anything. Hitler is raging in this war. He's taking some losses, he's having some wins. The German army is well equipped, they're very well prepared, they are brainwashed. The German people are absolutely brainwashed into thinking that the reason why Germany is not succeeding is because of the Jewish problem, they said. So Hitler comes up with the final solution. So keep in mind, Hitler's attention is always going to be divided between winning a war and killing Jewish people. Now this is a really important point, because I feel like if Hitler wasn't so consumed with his hatred of a group of people, I feel like all of his attention would have been devoted to winning the war, and he probably could have. But because of his extreme hatred and wanting to literally exterminate anybody who he felt inferior, Jewish people, Poles, Slavs, Catholics, Gypsies, anybody who was mentally or physically ill, he didn't have a need for. He just felt they were worthless and they should be killed for being worthless. And so the Holocaust is this horrible, awful tragedy raging on within the tragedy of World War II. If you watch this, be prepared. I mean, obviously you've seen The Boy in the Striped Pajamas and you've read Night, and there's some difficult scenes and ideas of really what's going on in the concentration camps. The German people knew, to the extent what they knew, I don't know. Keep in mind, some of the biggest concentration camps were not in Germany, they were in Poland. Well, the Polish people are in the concentration camps, so the people who were left maybe didn't speak up. Perhaps they knew, they didn't know the extent, but all in all, there's about 11 million people killed in concentration camps, 6 million of them Jewish people. Now, keep in mind, this is where I really want to get into today. All of this is happening in the European theater. We call it the European theater. It just means it's the World War II in Europe. But there's also World War II in the Pacific. And when we talk about the Pacific, it's really Japan versus the United States. Nobody was helping the United States in the Pacific. The United States is helping France and Britain in Europe. But believe me, nobody is helping the United States in the Pacific. And it's the United States versus Japan. And we have an incredibly strong Navy. We have gutsy, incredible Marines taking on a almost it was the Japanese will to fight was unlike anything, and I will say that like Germany was very well prepared. They were very well equipped. They were very well trained soldiers. They didn't have this drive to succeed and win at all costs the way the Japanese did. The Japanese would rather fight to the death, literally every last soldier, before they would ever surrender a battle. And so every single island, keep in mind how vast and wide the Pacific is, every single island was a fight to the death. There was no, oh, we're going to surrender this island, you can have it. It was nothing like that. And so it was severe and brutal and really, really difficult. So the World War II is going to end then in Europe. The beginning of the end starts with D-Day. That's June 6, 1944. I have also embedded the beginning of the movie Saving Private Ryan. That's the View Peer embedded link right there. Only watch it if you are fully prepared. I would not watch it if there are younger siblings around, or if you're just not in a place to really watch with caution, because D-Day was a very difficult landing, but it is the beginning of the end. There's a whole nother year of war that's going to happen in Europe, but it's what we consider the beginning of the end. I will say that D-Day, June 6, 1944, was considered an Allied success, but it wasn't without lots and lots of casualties. But now remember, World War II in Europe actually starts in North Africa and works its way up the peninsula of Italy. But then we divide forces, and now we're coming in from the northern part of Europe onto the French countryside. And so D-Day, it is a success. It was a bold strategy. It was a risky move, but it worked, and it was a success. So Hitler makes one last push. It's that year, December of 1944. It's called the Battle of the Bulge. The Battle of the Bulge happens in Belgium, in the woods, in the forests, the Ardennes forest in Belgium. It's Hitler's kind of last push. It was an incredibly tough battle, mostly because of the cold conditions, but the Allied forces hold out, and Hitler is defeated. It really doesn't end until January of 1945. By this point, Hitler has devoted so much more attention to the final solution, to the Holocaust. And so eventually Hitler will commit suicide, April 1945. And this is right about the time that the USSR and the Soviets have entered into Berlin, entered into Germany, and taken control of Berlin. So this is just a couple of days, May 7th, 1945, VE Day, Victory in Europe. The war in Europe is finally over. There's a famous picture right there. It's in Times Square. That man, he's a sailor. He comes up, he doesn't know this woman, doesn't know her at all, sees this nurse, and he's so ecstatic and happy that he just kisses her right there in this embrace. It's a famous picture. There's some information about the background I won't get into, but it's kind of a cute story if you ever want to look it up. Now, it seems like this is the biggest cause for celebration. Victory has come. The war is over. But the war in Europe is what's over. The war in the Pacific is dragging on. Remember, the Japanese do not surrender. They will not give up. Eventually, the United States gains Iwo Jima. And that's the raising of the flag right there at Iwo Jima. It was a very, very hard fought battle. Okinawa was probably just as worse with more casualties. Eventually, we are getting closer and closer to Japan, to seal off Japan. Now, this is really important. Remember, Japan is never going to surrender. For the past 4 years, Japan will only fight to the death. So now the United States has to make a decision. Remember, in the Pacific, it's the United States versus Japan. No, our allies do not come to help in the Pacific. France and Britain are not going to help the United States win the war against Japan. This is an American decision that has to be made. So in April, the same month that Hitler died, FDR dies. FDR had polio. Roosevelt had polio. He had been confined to a wheelchair for several years during the war. And he succumbs to his illness and he dies in April of 1945. That means his vice president, Harry Truman, now becomes president. And he has to make a decision. What do we do to stop the war? The war is now ended in Europe. What do we do to stop the war in the Pacific? And so Truman orders the dropping of nuclear bombs, a nuclear attack in the Pacific. The whole time, these secret weapons were being made and manufactured. Japan probably knew about it, maybe not to the extent. We know Germany absolutely knew about it. The guy who first came to the United States came from Austria because he was a Jewish man. He was scared of Hitler rounding him up. He came first to Britain in like 38, and then he came to the United States, and that man is Albert Einstein. And he kind of had this idea, and then another man named Oppenheimer made it happen. So we developed these bombs that had incredible capacity to devastate. And Truman orders bombs to be dropped on Japan as the only way to end the war. The first one was dropped on Hiroshima, August 6th, 1945. Nearly 200,000 residents immediately are incinerated. Think about that word, incinerated. Like gone, just burned, dead, gone, like up in ash immediately. That's not enough to do it though. You would think after Japan seeing the devastation and destruction that one bomb could do, they would surrender, but they didn't. And so 3 days later, we drop another bomb on Nagasaki. That kills another 40,000 people. Well, now Japan decides Emperor Hirohito, you can see him right there, signing on the deck of a ship, the surrender. What Japan was worried about is that we would drop a third one. What Japan didn't know is that we didn't have a third one. Japan thinks we will continue to drop these nuclear bombs on them. They don't know that the United States has only made 2. We've only made and successfully developed 2 bombs. They don't know that, and so they finally surrender. VJ Day, Victory in Japan, happens August 14th, 1945. So now we are finally to the end of the war. One thing that I will say is, dropping these bombs on Japan, on the mainland of Japan, kills millions of people. Now, it seems like it only killed maybe about 250,000 people. However, the effects of radiation in the following months were killing people every single day. The amount of radiation that was in the air was killing people. In fact, unfortunately, the effects of the radiation have lasted for generations. Generations of people have developed cancer because of the mutations made in their gene, in their genetic code, because of the dropping of these bombs. And this is my question then. This is what I want you to reflect on. Could there have been anything else that had been done? Do you think the bombs needed to be dropped in order to end the war in the Pacific? I want you to think about fighting on the mainland of Japan. I want you to think about the United States not really having a lot of allies. I want you to think of the logistical location of where Japan is. Think of how close they are to China. Think of how close they are to the USSR. I want you to think about all of these factors and decide, could the United States have done anything except drop the bombs on Japan? Was it an appropriate decision? And that's the paragraph prompt I want you to think about. So you have two things to do. You need to upload your Flipgrid projects if you haven't yet, and you need to write and do a reflection on ending the war in the Pacific with the dropping of the bombs. That's it for Monday and Tuesday, and by the end of the week you'll need to only respond to another student's project on Flipgrid. As always, give me an email or shout out if you need any help, and talk to you later. Bye.